In the second part of this video, we're going to go through, we're going to begin with connective tissue. This is the second of four major types of tissues in the body. In the last video, we talked about epithelial tissue. So let's look briefly at connective tissue. Connective tissue is a little different because you have a large amount of extracellular matrix. We kind of talked a little bit about extracellular matrix in the first part of the video, the first video we looked at. But here we have cells that are separated by a decent amount of extracellular matrix, depending on which type of connective tissue you're looking at, really. These are very abundant type of tissues. You're going to find these throughout the body. It's going to be in all of the organs of the body and throughout, really, the organism. And so we'll look at different types and functions for this. Now, this slide kind of shows you four of the major functions of some of the more commonly talked about connective tissues. We're going to see this type of information in our lab portion as well. But function number one is to connect and bind structures together. So, for example, your tendons and your ligaments. Your tendons that help to bind muscles to the bones, and your ligaments that help to connect bones to the bones. These are examples of connective tissue. And so these help to connect structures together. And so you also have other connective tissues that actually help to suspend or to bind the organs together. Support, that's another main function of connective tissue. And so your bone tissue is made out of connective tissue. And your cartilage that you have in your body is connective tissue. Protection, that's another major function. And so anywhere you find bones, you generally find protection, especially like the skull that's protecting the brain, and the rib cage, and the sternum that's protecting the chest cavity, the organs inside the chest cavity. And so, so that's a protective function of the bones and cartilage for that matter. Adipose, that's a special type of connective tissue. That's a special tissue that stores lipids or stores fats. And so that has a protective nature because it helps to cushion the body and the vital organs. And then you have immune cells that are part of really connective tissue. And that goes along with number four, transport, because your blood is a connective tissue. It is a collection of cells that kind of work together. So it's a tissue, but it's surrounded by an extracellular matrix. But in this case, your blood is actually a liquid. Your blood that has a plasma circulating in it, that's the extracellular matrix that's part of the connective tissue. And so your immune cells that are in your blood, and then the blood is functioning as transport. These are all examples here of connective tissue. Now, when you find connective tissue, you also find certain types of cell types, and these cell types are responsible for making and maintaining that type of extracellular matrix. And so make a note of each of these endings. These are kind of the endings of a couple of words: blast, site, and clast. And so anytime you see the ending blast, it's responsible for, that cell type is responsible for making that, that extracellular matrix. A lot of times students remember it because B stands for, like build, or building the matrix, creating the matrix. And so an osteoblast, for example, osteo, the prefix there refers to bone cells or to bone. And so an osteoblast is a cell inside of your bones that's responsible for making or building the bone matrix. An osteocyte, because it has the ending cyte, site, it's a bone cell that's basically there to support the tissue and maintain the matrix. In other words, it can produce some of the extracellular matrix, but it doesn't do that in a large amount. And so it can maintain the matrix. That's its main function. And then a clast is a cell that has the ability to actually break down or dissolve the matrix. And so an osteoclast would be a bone cell that actually breaks down the extracellular matrix inside a bone. Other cell types that you'll find inside of connective tissue would be fibroblast. And so here's another example of that word that we just looked at. Fibroblast is a cell that helps to produce the protein fibers that are inside of that matrix. It produces fibers or protein fibers. Adipose, we just kind of mentioned, this is a tissue type. An adipocyte would be the actual cell, and they function to help to store fats or lipids. Mast cells, these are special types of cells that you'll find in the blood, and they help in the inflammatory response. And so you'll find those in the blood. And then phagocytes, that's a special type of immune cell. We'll talk more about these in 169 when you cover the immune system. But a phagocyte is a type of cell that has the ability to engulf or eat or to take in some kind of foreign substance. Maybe it's a microorganism, maybe it's just a dead or broken down cell or cell debris, but it's part of your immune system. And these are also found in connective tissue. Phagocytes and mast cells are both found in the blood vessels, in the blood. All right, the next type of tissue we'll mention would be muscle tissue. And so for muscle tissue, this is a specialized type, one of the main 4 types of tissue, but it stands out because it is specialized for contraction. It can shorten itself using force, and that creates the force that we need for movement of the body. And so the muscle cell that makes up muscle tissue is called a myocyte. So make a note of that. Myo refers to muscle, and cyte refers to cell. So the muscle cell is also called a myocyte. And it has a special characteristic in that it is excitable. It has ability to receive an electrical stimulus and respond to some kind of electrical or chemical stimulation. Now, muscle tissue is made out of cells that have 2 types of protein bundles or myofilaments, and we'll talk more about this in a later chapter when we talk more closely about the muscular system and the muscle physiology. But for now, we'll just kind of mention a couple of things. One is that the muscle cells do have these myofilaments. This is actin and myosin, and they have special arrangements inside of the cells. There are 3 main types of muscle tissue, and I'll give you those in just a minute on another slide. But 3 main types of muscle tissue, 2 of which have an alternating light and dark pattern of these myofilaments, and those are called striated muscle cells. If the muscle cell looks like it has stripes or striations, you can see this through the microscope, and you can kind of look at this in lab. You'll see alternating patterns of light and dark regions. That means that muscle cell is striated. And that's because of how the myofilaments, the actin and myosin, is arranged inside of the cell. A smooth muscle, as the name implies, doesn't have that same arrangement. You don't have the alternating dark and light. The myofilaments are still there. You still have actin and myosin, but they're just in an irregular shaped bundle instead of being repeating light and dark sections. So let me show you some examples here, and we'll see this again in lab. Skeletal muscle, that's one example of muscle tissue. This is striated, and so when you look at the picture here, and here's the actual on the right, you can kind of see the actual microscope image, and so you can see those lines running up and down. The actual cell is this long rectangular looking section there. It's a very long cell, and then you see perpendicular to that all of these light, kind of pink and light regions. So skeletal muscle is striated. It's voluntary. That means you can control it. You can cause skeletal muscles to move or contract. And they are also multinucleate because they have many or more than one nucleus inside of the cell. Cardiac muscle, this is only found in the heart, and this is also striated. And so when you look, sometimes the striations don't appear quite as easily seen, especially when you look at the image from the light microscope, but they do have striations running up and down. This is involuntary, means you don't technically control your heart rate. It's being controlled, but you can't physically control it. But it is being regulated. They are uninucleate. They only have one nucleus per cell. You can kind of see a little picture of the nucleus there, and maybe you see a little nucleus around these cells. So usually it just has a single nucleus, and they have a special function here. And we mentioned this back in chapter 3, that these have intercalated discs. This is how these are connected. So you see the little lines here of intercalations. In other words, this cell kind of overlaps with the next cell to form a tight type of connection. That's also where you find gap junctions, and these are openings or pores that allow ions to flow through from cell to cell. This is how these cells are going to communicate electrical signals very, very quickly and efficiently. You want your cardiac muscle cells to be able to communicate very quickly so that everything contracts on time, in rhythm, and that everything is synchronized. Smooth muscle, this is a third type of muscle tissue, and this is non-striated. This is the only type of muscle cell that is not striated. So this is non-striated. You don't have the alternating effects. You don't have the light and dark patterns here. And so it does look very smooth. And this is also involuntary. So you're not controlling this directly like you do your skeletal muscle. And it's also uninucleate. You only have a single nucleus per cell. And so you would find smooth muscle, let's say for your digestive tract. It lines your digestive tract. It's what's helping food to pass through your esophagus, down into your stomach, through your intestines. You have smooth muscle there. So many of your organs that move a little bit have some smooth muscle around them. You also find this in your blood vessels. Your blood vessels have the ability to contract and to relax, and so they have a layer of smooth muscle around the vessel. Now, the last type of tissue out of the four main types we'll look at here is nervous tissue. And again, we'll have another chapter, actually a complete unit, dealing with the nervous system and nervous tissue. So we'll look back at this a little later in the semester. But nervous tissue, you'll find located in the brain, the spinal cord, and all of the nerves of the body has nervous tissue there. We'll talk about two main cell types, and of course, all of the types of tissues have some amount of extracellular matrix, and so there's some extracellular matrix associated with nervous tissue as well. The two cell types are located here, neurons and neuroglial cells. And the neurons, those are the main type of nervous system cells, and they receive and send signals in the form of what's called an action potential, and we'll see that a little later in the semester. And so the neurons are the basic type of cell you'll find in nerve tissue. And then you have some other helping type cells called neuroglial cells, and there's some examples of this, several examples of these glial type cells that we'll look at. And they're basically there for support. They help the process of your brain function and your nervous system actions and the signals that are traveling through your nerves. They need help from other cells, and we'll look at some of those examples a little later in the course. So those are the four major types of tissues in the body. And again, we'll revisit some of these as we go through the chapters. We'll see these a little more. So for example, chapter 5 is on integumentary, and it's mainly made out of the epithelial tissue, although there is some connective tissue there and some muscle and some nerve tissue. So we'll talk about each one of these types of tissues as we go through the rest of the course. Now, section 7 of chapter 4 deals with membranes, and so we need to briefly talk about some membranes, and we'll talk about these in lab as well. But you have different types of membranes in the body. One type of membrane that you'll find is called a mucous membrane. You'll usually find mucous membranes lining the cavities that open to the outside of the body. So it's there for protection. You have openings to the respiratory system and to the digestive system, to the urinary tract. And so you've got to have some type of protection there. And so you'll find some mucous membranes that produce mucus. Now there's a special cell type here. We mentioned this before. It's a gland cell called a goblet cell, and its function is to produce and secrete mucus. And so these mucous membranes are basically epithelial tissue. You have a basement membrane, and you have a little bit of what's called loose connective tissue that kind of covers over that membrane. And so these are examples. I've already mentioned the respiratory, the digestive system, the urinary system, and the reproductive system will have these types of mucous membranes. Now you also find something called serous membranes. These are also epithelial type tissue. Sometimes you see this referred to as mesothelium, and it's a type of tissue that covers around your organs and lines your cavities. This is internal, and so it's lining the cavities that are not exposed to the outside of the body. And so it's mainly epithelial tissue with a little bit of loose connective tissue there as well. Three main examples we'll look at would be the pericardium or the pericardial membrane. And as the name implies, peri means around and cardio refers to the heart. And so this is a membrane that you have surrounding the heart. It's a serous type membrane. Pleural refers to the lungs. And so you have a serous type membrane that covers and protects the lungs. Peritoneal, this type of membrane here is found in the abdominal cavity, and it's a relatively large membrane that it covers many of the organs inside of the abdominal cavity. Now, one other thing about the serous type membranes is they secrete a little bit of fluid called serous fluid that is trapped in between the inner layer and the outer layer of that membrane. The serous membranes are kind of a two-layer membrane system. So that serous fluid is inside of that membrane, and it kind of creates a nice little cushion to help protect your cavities and your organs. Then the third type of membrane system we'll look at, and we'll see this more when we get to the joints chapter in lab, synovial joints or synovial membranes. These are membranes mainly made up of connective tissue, and this is going to be right around your freely movable joints, such as your knee joint and your elbow joint and your shoulder joint. All of these movable, very movable joints have a synovial membrane there. You find this chemical we've mentioned before called hyaluronic acid, and that's a chemical that really helps in lubrication of that joint. Here you see in the diagram a little picture there. This is a picture, a side view of the knee joint, and you have connective tissue that kind of encloses that joint, and inside of this you would have a synovial type membrane that produces a fluid that goes inside of this joint cavity, and that allows your joint to move a little easier. Of course, you have cartilage there as well, but you'll have this fluid there with the hyaluronic acid to try to help move that joint a little easier without as much friction. Now, the last topic we'll look at in this chapter in the lecture portion is tissue repair. There's a section there towards the end of the chapter, section 8, that deals with tissue repair, and a couple of terms here. The first one is regeneration. So let's say you get some damage to a tissue. You want to be able to regenerate that tissue to try to repair the damage. And so regeneration is whenever you repair tissue with the same type of tissue that just got damaged. So for example, let's say you get a cut on your skin. Well, your skin is epithelial tissue, and I'll show you a picture of this in just a second from the textbook. But if you get a damage, actually here's the picture. It shows, here's a section of your skin. You've got epithelial tissue on top of the skin layer here. And let's say you have some kind of damage there. Well, it's going to try to regenerate the epithelial cells and replace it with new epithelial cells. And so everything will function correctly. So that's called regeneration, when you're replacing the damaged cells with the exact same cell type that you started with. That's regeneration. Fibrosis is whenever you develop a scarring type tissue. So instead of regenerating, you're still healing the area, but it doesn't get the exact same tissue is not used to repair the problem in this case. And so, for example, here you have an example of some cardiac muscle cells, and there's some damage that could occur with cardiac muscle cells. But instead of building new muscle cells, your body doesn't replace those cardiac muscle cells with actual cardiac tissue. Instead, it's going to fill it in with scar tissue. That's called fibrosis. That's because you have cells called fibroblasts, like we mentioned before. The fibroblasts build a protein-type matrix, and you're going to end up with, you've repaired the damage, but you've replaced that tissue with collagen fibers and extracellular matrix. So that's a scarring type tissue. What that means is this doesn't function any longer as cardiac muscle cells. That's not muscle cells. And so this type of tissue repair, it repaired the problem. It just didn't return it to its original state. And so that means that it's not going to function correctly. So if you have heart damage and you replace it with scar tissue, it's not going to function as cardiac muscle tissue any longer. We'll cover these types of tissues. Again, the four main types of tissues. And in lab, I'll give you many different examples of each type. For epithelial, connective tissue, the muscle tissue, of course, there's only 3. We'll look at those in lab. And then the nerve tissue, I'll give you a chance to kind of look at the nerve cells in lab as well.